Friends, one thing is clear. If you are going to be a book thug, you must work harder. If this is something that you can not understand, then what do you think will happen? You will write terrible poetry, and you will not be a book thug. So, you must work, and you must work harder. I say work, you say harder. Work, harder. Work, harder. Work, harder. Work. Harder. And friends, no one has worked harder to write, you must work harder to write poetry of excellence than Donato Mancini. In fact, he has worked harder than any human alive to produce many works of literature that you must work harder to believe were that difficult to write. He is that dedicated to his project to work as hard as he can so that you can work harder than anyone alive to work and work at reading. You must work harder to write poetry of excellence. Ladies and gentlemen, Donato Mancini.
Actually, I just wrote this last weekend. Thanks, everyone, for coming. And thanks, of course, to the book thugs. I'm a little too nervous to give much of an introduction or anything. It seems a bit odd to be reading critical prose amidst all this poetry, but it won't be that long, so it'll be over soon. And if you don't know about the book, it's called "You Must Work Harder to Write Poetry of Excellence." In case you didn't pick that up from what Jay just said, and so as you might infer from the title, work is one of the themes in the book. The book goes through reviews of Canadian poetry since the early '60s until about 2008, and tries to locate tropes and metaphors and patterns of thought, etc., that are consistent through that whole period. And one of the main things that emerges in the way that value is constructed in poetry reviews is this specific fetishization of work. It plays out in different, in the reviews of different writers in different ways. But with certain writers, it goes so far that there's almost this kind of like labor theory of value constructed, as if the value in poetry is almost the value of poetry is almost exactly proportional to the amount of like time spent on the literary hamster wheel, as if poems are sort of like rechargeable batteries that you just like fill with the energy of labor, and the section I'm going to read is more or less the culmination of all the themes. A lot of things come together. It's the last section in the book before the epilogue. And it deals with the reviews of a book you might have heard of. I don't know if I'm pronouncing its name right. It's called Eunoia, I think. You might have heard of it. I think it was written by a Toronto writer. Or was it a Calgary writer? I'm not quite sure. Okay, anyhow, I'll just read it and you'll see. There's certain things you'll miss not having read the rest of the book, but I think it'll become clear enough as I go along. The section is called 7 Hours, 7 Days, and 7 Years. In this context, it is instructive to consider the marketing and critical reception of Christian Book's 2001 book, Eunoia. By its unmatched popularity alone, Eunoia has greatly expanded the room for institutional recognition and the reproductive potential of postmodern poetry in Canada. Eunoia's success as such, more directly than its content or as a formal model, alters the topography of the Canadian poetic field more than any other single book published since the 1970s. From the start, Eunoia's reception in reviews, positive and negative, is dominated by the discourse of craft, with an acute focus on labor as value. This effect is partly by design of the poet and publisher. The marketing of the book plays on the terms of the dominant evaluative idiolect and plays directly on the place of work in reviewers' aesthetic consciences. Before a single copy reaches bookstores, a legend of Eunoia's impossibly arduous making has already been constructed. First, the extreme formal constraint against which the book is written is straightforwardly material enough to boil down to the brevity of a Hollywood pitch. As reviewer Patty Osborne relates, Eunoia is divided into 5 chapters, one for each of the 5 vowels, and each chapter tells an outlandish story with words that contain only that value. An extremely difficult writerly task to accomplish, readers learn before they buy or read the book that the poet worked 7 hours per day, for 7 days per week for 7 years, or was it 4 or 5 hours, as Robert Stacey quotes book saying, to write Eunoia. Immediately, the frameworks of skill, mastery, labor, difficulty, diligence are invoked. And in a negative reflection, the exploitative conditions of the wage contract. The author performs for the common reviewer of Canadian poetry exactly the phantasmic figure of the writer that Roland Barthes draws, the writer who shuts himself away in some legendary place, like a workman operating at home, and who roughs out, cuts, polishes, and sets his form exactly as a jeweler extracts art from his material, devoting to his work regular hours of solitary effort. Eunoia is a postmodern work in its construction and in its self-contextualization within the poetic field. The book is postmodern in the sense that it self-consciously restages a high modernist compositional strategy as a book trade high media event. Postmodern in its invention and realization of its own strict formal procedure, and postmodern in the sense of postmodern in the sense of pseudo-humanist reviewers who find it utterly cynical in its lack of moral affect, its lack of authorial voice, and its lack of accessible philosophical reflection on the human condition. Yet Eunoia purchases, by a legend of its labor, an incomparable moral innocence and fetishistic value within the permamodern linguistic economy, a depth of innocence that most postmodern books can never afford. Eunoia is a socially complex proposition, which is what makes it an important book. Not that Eunoia, as Linda Hutcheon argues about much Canadian postmodern fiction, asserts and then deliberately undermines such principles as value, order, meaning, control, and identity that have been the basic premises of bourgeois liberalism. Rather, it's that Eunoia simultaneously both confirms and disavows those premises on multiple levels. While being laborious and intricate in construction, its content is nihilist data comedy. To the dominant idiolect, Eunoia's literary high-mindedness is entirely indexed in its evaluation of labor, its meticulous verbal construction, and its careful self-insertion into a chosen historical trajectory. Book's labor, note, is the labor to magnificently surpass his predecessors in Oulipo, not to produce a severe historical rupture. As Bourdieu writes, the presence of the specific past is most visible of all among the avant-garde producers who are controlled by the past when it comes to their intention to surpass it, an intention itself linked to the state of the history of the field. It is the product of a disposition formed by the history of the field and informed by that history, and hence inscribed into the continuity of the field. But the monologic address of its symbolic package, its paratexts, that the book expresses sublime thought, i.e. continuous with dominant modes of value, contradicts the poem's devilishly absurdist content. To reviewers unwilling to read form, context, historical position as dimensions of a work's meaning, its content predictably reads what they might prudishly call mental masturbation, masturbation being a sinful habit of idle hands. Or in different terms, McCaffrey's semiotic general expenditure. Quoting Eunoia from chapter U, Ubu hugs Ruth, thus Ruth purrs. Ubu untucks Ruth's muumuu, thus Ruth must untruss Ubu's tucks. Ubu fluffs Lulu's tutu. Ubu cups Lulu's dugs. Ubu rubs Lulu's buns. Thus Lulu must pull Ubu's pud. Ubu blurts, push push. Ubu thrusts, Ubu bucks. Cum spurts, Ubu comes. Robert Stacey ventures an eloquent defense of Eunoia in his essay Toil and Trouble on Work in Christian Bach's Eunoia, on the grounds that the symbolic role it gives to labor exemplifies an optimistic, quasi-revolutionary belief in the future, a fierce struggle out towards freedom through the symbolic constraint of necessity. Eunoia, Stacey continues, is work as a process of transformation, of appropriating and reshaping material nature, which brings the one realm to the threshold of the other, and which connects the present to an as yet unrealized future. An idea of history as process is impossible without an idea of work, because only work can bring about an end to its own necessity. Yet, as a position taking in the field of Canadian poetry, Eunoia cannot be complacently celebrated in this way. To do so is to make the same historical error as the Arnoldian Levisite critic whose aesthetic conscience compels him to find a morally salutary value in of itself in any work of art that he judges outstanding, whatever its propositional content or political matrix. Stacy's reading of the potential social meaning of labor and form in Eunoia is not incorrect, just too virtuously partial, too programmatically liberal leftist. No, art does not have to be morally or politically good to be good art. Instead, like the embezzler poet constructed by Kenneth Goldsmith, the poet of Eunoia's legend, and the example of Eunoia as an object, is in deep moral contradiction, staked in several incompatible social positions at once. In the very least, as virtually every reviewer notes, the imperative of righteous labor, of working harder for poetic excellence, is abundantly overfilled in Eunoia. Reviewers convey frequently that Eunoia makes a spectacle of its labor, quoting Book's own pronouncement. Eunoia is compelled to make the spectacle by sheer structural pressures. As Bourdieu writes, art cannot deliver the truth about art without concealment by turning this unveiling into an artistic manifestation. Yet in content, Eunoia is an Alfred Jarry-esque book of boyish sci-fi nihilism and absurdist comedy. On the one hand, Book's poet is the model poetry Stakhanovite, yet his other values, his aesthetico-moral imperatives, are wrong. Low-minded comedy of the kind in Eunoia is a mode of writing to which the dominant Canadian poetry reviewer's aesthetic conscience can never ascribe supreme cultural value. To devote so much labor to unserious comedy is, in its terms, inherently wasteful. Eunoia does make a spectacle of its labor in various ways. Aside from its pre-packaging and legend, as Stacy notes, the singing in Eunoia takes place under duress, against a countermanding pressure that is registered in the language and structure of the sentences themselves, which at every moment announce the effort that went into their production. Further, as Stacy also identifies, numerous passages in the poem are about labor and craftsmanship. Aside from the first-person sections about writing, several sections directly contradict the ejaculatory general expenditure passages of Chapter U. In Chapter I, for example, pilgrims digging in shifts dig till midnight in mining pits, chipping flint with picks, drilling schist with drills, striking it rich, mining zinc. Irish firms, hiring mix, whilst firing Brits, bring in smiths with mining skills, kilnwrights grilling brick in brick kilns, millwrights grinding grist in grist mills. Irish tinsmiths, fiddling with widgets, fix this rig, driving its drills, which spin whirling drill bits. When they evaluate the product of this labor, Eunoia's detractors are partially right that it demonstrates empty productivity, as Carmen Sternino said. Yes, it is precisely as empty productivity that Eunoia can register an implicit critique of global consumer culture. It shows up ordinary wage work as the exploitative brutality that it is, with neither belief in future emancipation or reflex nostalgia for simpler times. Were it written through the same constraints but filled with high-minded thematic content of official verse culture, the plane of that content would dominate its reception entirely. As per usual, reviewers would be entirely off the hook about the significance of form and would set their focus on the poetic vision, the noble themes, the memorable image content, and salubrious moral lessons, etc. Labor as form would not be made spectacular. Labor would not emerge as a trope, as part of its manner of meaning, as well as the key to its subject matter. Form, again, would be relegated to a passive role as vessel or cordoned off as a separate interpretive or evaluative issue. In either case, when they transmit the legend, reviewers usually omit the key word of Book's frequently quoted pronouncement from the afterword to Eunoia. And this is the afterword, or the quote from the afterword. The text makes a Sisyphean spectacle of its labor, willfully crippling its language in order to show that, even under such improbable conditions of duress, language can still express an uncanny, if not sublime, thought. Book writes Sisyphean. The labor is anti-heroic, unproductive, absurd. Yet reviewers often respond as if he writes Herculean. Through the legend of its labor, Eunoia satisfies the most crucial terms of entry, whereas its comically absurdist content mocks with perfect malice the demagogical pretensions of the upper middle brow Canadian official verse culture. Eunoia at once satisfies and critiques the dominant ideology of the Canadian Poetry Review in its own terms. It is not so significant that a labor legend about this book exists. It is that such a high proportion of all notices and reviews of the book retell the legend. Uncountable books have such legendary backgrounds. Poets like Margaret Avison, Robin Blazer, and Jeff Dirksen are famously patient and unprolific. Many books that took as long and were as difficult to write as Eunoia will never sell a fraction as many copies. Many others, far easier to write, will sell many more. Yet even Eunoia's most programmatically hostile reviewer, Carmine Starnino, recounts the exemplary tale of labor, skill, and determination. I'm quoting Starnino. How else explain the growing legend of its execution? Books slog through the OED, the long evenings of revision, the 7 years of toil. Sometimes we need to witness such self-punishing acts of technical adroitness to shake up our cherished idea of poetry as a muse-inspired sport. What isn't silly is the sedulous skill it took to write. To give credit where credit is due, poets who can bring off this sort of thing aren't exactly thick on the ground here. Again, Eunoia is a socially complex proposition. Starnino values the labor evidenced for providing an acid purgative to the sentimentality of naive muse lovers. The focus of the positional antagonism is thus complicated by the fact of a shared ethos on one crucial point. As Stacy notes, in Utopian practice, the idea of writing as work displaces a model of poetic inspiration. Starnino is categorically compelled to give Eunoia some accreditation in the dominant idiolect. An odor of cruel ritual, as Nietzsche and Barthes predict, wafts out of the diction in which Starnino constructs his accreditation: self-punishment, slog, long evenings, toil. The non-silly aspect of the poem, its innocence, is precisely what is purchased through long, long hours in the woodshed. Diligence is made righteous by what it costs in burnt flesh. His sedulous skill is not silly. Hard-won skill is untheorizable, absolute, blood and guts value. The positional contrast Starnino makes in lines that follow confirm this point. With a lithe maneuver, Starnino affiliates himself with book's hard-won virtuosity and elevates himself as reviewer and poet from the flabby rabble thick on the ground, but not with book's aesthetic conscience. Book's imperatives are perversely beneath the aesthetic morality of Homo economus aestheticus, represented by Starnino. As in Starnino's review, the conscientious deliberation hinges on whether the 7 years of toil were Sisyphean or Herculean. Supportive reviewers are careful to indicate that they believe that the time was not wasteful expenditure, not Sisyphean, not empty productivity, but properly accumulative, heroic, and Herculean. This is the key. To its defenders, Eunoia stores so much magical labor energy that the sublime remains to eclipse the absurd. They do not seem to notice how insistently and pleasurably goofy it is. With his sedulous skill alone, Book can be constructed as a master craftsman. As Michael Basilières declares in the Danforth Review, the 7 years of effort Book poured into the Eunoia have paid off. It is not only one of the best books of the year, it is quite simply a masterpiece. In a snowblinding phrase such as quite simply, obsolete categories of value assert themselves with the blunt force typical of the ideological. As in Sullivan's review of Lionel Kearns above, categorically challenged by a new work, aesthetic conscience can expand the envelope of an old definition to achieve quiet. Yet if conscience thus finds reassurance, the price once again is the work's social, historical complexity. Calling Eunoia simply a masterpiece is a recuperative act of ideological mummification that freeze-dries the book from museum shelves of tradition to spare conscience the dilemmas of its more significant problematic implications. Eunoia is celebrated as a form of work. Eunoia is attacked as a form of work. Soon after Eunoia wins the Griffin Prize in 2002, a parody entitled Anoia, under the pseudonym Constrained Box, appears in the mailboxes of Toronto poets. Anoia's rhetorical goal is specifically to diminish the labor legend of Eunoia by making Book's work seem easy to write. As reviewer Alex Good ruminates, it couldn't have taken 7 years to come up with stuff like this. 7 minutes with a good dictionary would do the trick. And in parentheses, the occult number 7 flashes through the reviews like a numerological beacon, a magical fetish. Similarly, Eunoia is attacked as unproductive play rather than as serious work of poetry. Play, even if it is cumulative in other ways and libidinally gratifying, can only accrue limited value. Play is never cruel enough, never violent enough to be virtuous. Pseudonymous reviewer Clive Staples, the name is taken from C.S. Lewis, whose full name is Clive Staples Lewis, contrasts more valuable work-like play to valueless, frivolous forms of play. In quotes, traditional poetic forms, including the hardest of them all, free verse, are like chess. Lipograms are like tic-tac-toe. So chess is a rehearsal for war, combative logic, and martial ritual. Tic-tac-toe is an effete, mushy-headed pastime. Even if Clive Staples is possibly book parodying his own antagonists, the parody is exact. More invested detractors like Linda Grace Phillipson cannot understand, in quotes, why someone of Book's obvious ingenuity would choose to spend 7 years on such a masochistic infliction, or is that affliction? To Phillipson, Book has wasted precious life energy, talent, and time. She implies that if a stupid person were to behave this way, it would be understandable. Of course, says ideology. But someone of such obvious ingenuity? When a talented poet writes in another mode of value than the reviewer's own, it is a tragic annoyance. Or, as Alex Good writes, you're always left with the big tease of its conception. Why did Christian Book choose to write a book like this? Starnino asks, all is well and good, but why would anyone wish to write this way other than for the mere curiosity of it? A curiosity, a toy, unproductive expenditure, useless work. Robert Stacey's tart retort to David Solway's similar question is apt here. Good and Starnino can't see merit in Eunoia because they make no effort to answer their own questions. The referential circularity of the idiolect forecloses their inquiry. Under a paradigm of mimesis, reflection, and expression, poetry reviewers often cannot see the point of postmodern poetry. They cannot see what it encrypts. They seek a solution to a riddle that the work does not, in fact, pose. Illiterates of form, all they can say is that Eunoia doesn't have any kind of purpose or point except as an experiment. Its prime directive is the only thing it has to say. In one case, at least, the innocence that the labor legend of Eunoia purchases is so great that it produces a serious dilemma for a conscientious reviewer. On the one hand, the form of labor that went into its making gives the poem absolute, unimpeachable value. And in parentheses, Eunoia stores quality like a precious electric charge, if ever a Canadian book of poetry has. On the other hand, Book's aesthetic imperative, as read out of the content, is misguided, pointless, unproductive, or mad. Although his review suggests that he did not actually read the book, Lyle Neff finds himself pinched between the pro-con say-what positions above. He writes in Eunoyance how the Griffin decision favors effort over accomplishment that, in quoting, Eunoia is not a digital piece of work, but represents, one hates to say it, a triumph of the eccentric human will. It is painful when reading it to think how hard this man worked on this book. But if we grant that Short Haul Engine and Eunoia are both good books, which took some heavy artistic lifting to make, doesn't Soley's book gain the aesthetic upper hand because it is a more buoyant read? In this excerpt, Neff posits the conventional antagonism between the inauthentic forces of postmodernity, the digital, and authentic modern, the human. When he discovers that Christian Book is not the name of an algorithm, he reluctantly admits this poet to the order of the eccentric human. Somehow, this is in fact more of a threat. One hates to say it is painful. The trope that Neff then evokes has much more immediate rhetorical force than that of the plastic/digital, the Third Reich. Neff implies that Eunoia is a Nazi-esque, Ubermenschian triumph of the will. To Neff, Book is human but possibly psychopathic. Note that Neff never once exits the gift shop paradigm of labor as value. Eunoia, curiously, amply affirms the labor as value as quality ideology through the legend of its construction, to such an extent that he is forced to admit it into the realm of true poetry. Neff is forced to grant that both are good books, which took some heavy artistic lifting to make. He grants this reluctantly, in spite of the fact that when tested in almost all of the other terms of the dominant evaluative idiolect, the content of Eunoia produces very few unambiguous positives. For example, in a review by Gordon Neufeld, using trick as non-productive play, as Brian Fawcett did, Neufeld says, Eunoia is little more than a party trick, because if you set aside the fact that Book uses only one vowel in each section and examine the work for other poetic merits, it has few. Neff is stuck with the serious dilemma of how to arrive conscientiously at the conclusion that Soley's book is better. He accomplishes this by altering his definition of labor. Neff's actual conclusion is that short-haul engine is better and more prizeworthy because it was, in truth, harder to write than Eunoia. Although Eunoia may have demanded longer hours at the desk and a greater blitzkrieg of ingenuity, Soli's genuinely human form of labor is the more costly and therefore the more authentic. Thank you.